Attending today's event. We will wait a few minutes to allow time for everyone to log on. Before we start the program, I would like to recognize Dr. Nate Marshall, one of our Doors of Distinction board members. He is currently Assistant Professor of English at Colorado College and has invited his students in one of his classes to attend today's lecture. We would like to thank him and his students for attending today. I think we're going to go ahead and begin. We still have a few more coming in. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Work of Black Music, Commodore Classroom. On behalf of the Association of Vanderbilt Black Alumni, AVBA, and the Vanderbilt Alumni Association, thank you for joining us. My name is Valerie Williams, and I am currently serve as the AVBA president. We are thrilled to highlight the work of Professor Lordi and Professor Reed today and engage in meaningful discussion. If you have any questions during today's webinar, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to send in your questions. And at the end of the presentation, I will ask Professor Lordi as many questions as time allows. Now it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today's event. Associate Professor of English, Emily J. Lordi, is a writer, professor, and cultural critic whose work focuses on African-American literature and Black music. She is the author of 3 books: Black Renaissance, Iconic Women Singers in African-American Literature, Donny Hathaway Live, and The Meaning of Soul. In addition to her scholarship, she contributes freelance essays to such venues as the New York Times Style Magazine, NewYorker.com, and The Atlantic. Associate Professor of English, Anthony Reed, is a scholar and a critic of African-American poetry, music, and media. His work emphasizes the complex ways artists interact with their social, political, and historical context. He is the author of 2 books, Freedom Time, The Poetics and Politics of Black Experimental Writing, and Soundworks, Sound, Race, and Poetry in Production, forthcoming later in 2020. I will now turn it over to Professor Lordi and Professor Reed to begin their presentation.
Hi, all. Thank you so much. I want to quickly begin by thanking Valerie, Kate, and Caroline for all the work that they have done to make this event and this conversation possible. We're very grateful for the opportunity to be in conversation with each other about our books and about the title concept, the work of Black music, which I'll just quickly explain, refers both to the work that Black music can potentially do in the world, right? The change that it can potentially affect, but also to the work that it requires to produce the music in the first place, which is something that we are both invested in analyzing and highlighting, as well as finally the work that it takes to make the music mean, right? The idea that there isn't just this sort of like inherent meaning in the music that anybody who listens to it will derive the same thing from it. There's also a lot of literary and other forms of discourse that have traditionally, historically surrounded the music to help us hear what it means, you know, beyond the lyrical content and its broader social and cultural significance. So that's something that some things that we're interested in broadly and that unite our work. I will just quickly give a kind of thumbnail sketch of my book, which is called The Meaning of Soul, Black Music and Resilience Since the 1960s. It was published this past summer in August. And it is trying to offer, just briefly, a new definition of soul that thinks about it not just as this kind of very vague, abstract, nebulous concept, but rather as a kind of concrete concept for living, you know, an idea about survival, and specifically about what Black people historically had sort of earned by coming through so many historical trials, that the kind of payoff to that was called soul. And in theorizing it, people, Black people sort of came together in this particular moment of the late 1960s, early 1970s, a radical, revolutionary, very challenging moment for a lot of people. The idea of having soul, having overcome and being ready, therefore, to do it again, as it would, inevitably be required, really helped people, and the music, the way that relates to the music of soul, is that I think that the artists who came to be known as some of the most important iconic soul artists were they were performing that very idea of resilience for people on a national stage. So some of the artists that I look at with that are people like Aretha Franklin and Nina Simone. I'm really keen to highlight the women of the soul tradition, who have not historically been really given a central role or valued in terms of their central role. But I look at women such as Aretha and Nina, Minnie Riperton, who graces the cover of the book, as well as other artists such as Isaac Hayes, Al Green, Donny Hathaway, and James Brown, in order, again, to give this different vision of soul, both as a musical concept or a musical kind of genre, but also, and even more importantly, as a kind of philosophical concept that the music helped to advance. Do you want to, Anthony, tell a little bit about your book?
Yes, and Soundworks takes up recorded collaborations between poets and musicians during what I call the long Black arts era. So the Black arts movement traditionally is understood to just be a moment when a lot of artists, many of them based in Harlem, but by no means exclusively based there, began to seek one another out to rethink the very grounds on which they would make art, and explicitly to make art for Black audiences. And this meant building not just the writing that they did or the painting or the plays, the drama, but even investment in institutions and building things in their communities. So looking at recorded collaborations allows me to highlight some of those institutions, especially independent publishing, but it also lets me look at the ways that the very media world that they built in the journals and the essays that they published and so on really helped to create the meaning of the sound that we would then hear. The artists include Langston Hughes and Charles Dominguez, Amiri Baraka collaborating with the New York Art Quartet primarily, but also his recording with Steve McCall and David Murray. I touch on Archie Shepp and a contemporary artist named Matana Roberts. I have chapters on Cecil Taylor and Jean Lee, and kind of end with a discussion of Jane Cortez. And in each of these, I really take as a starting point the difficulty of the music and the difficulty of the poetry. And if in the moment people understood free jazz, especially, to be linked to a kind of Black nationalist project, and on that basis, critics today who are no longer view Black nationalism favorably to dismiss it, I think that it's better to approach it from both what it created, but also what exactly it refused, and to think about the forms of incoherence, the difficulty, the noisiness, the unruliness, as really trying to advance something, as trying to make space for something new to emerge. And if it's still hard to hear it, it's really because the conditions for the revolution that the artists imagine still have not really been realized, and those revolutions await their realization in the presence. And the record is important for that, because records hold that, they hold the material that at any moment can be reactivated. So that's the broad outline of my book.
That's great. Can you talk a little bit about, I really love what you said about the difficulty of the music and of the poetry as being a way not only to create something that didn't exist, but to do away with, to abolish something that did, in order to make room for something new, including new ways of hearing and seeing, right, and being together. And I'm curious as to, a lot of our projects, especially such a long-term, long-haul kind of project like a book, is motivated I always think both by kind of love and also by a kind of hate, which is to say, not only by things that you really care about and are passionate about, but also by a sort of impatience with the ways that these subjects have been historically or academically discussed. So can you say a little bit about the love component and also the hate component of your book?
Yes, thank you. And I'll ask you the same actually in a moment. I would say briefly that it's really motivated by love of the music. I've found my way to jazz at some point in high school, and I found my way really to hear free jazz through John Coltrane when I was in college, and um, continue to encounter people who want to discredit it, who want to say it's just noise, it's not, including people like Charles Mingus, who really have a fraught relationship to it. But I have found and continue to find myself drawn to it, and to want to learn to listen to it better and to share that listening with other people. That's really, I think, the fundamental motivation, but the poetry as well, which is often dismissed as this was a great song until somebody started reciting a poem and people think that they know what the poem is there for. And I in short, think we didn't. Critics have either ignored the poetry or have said dismissive things about it. And it's this other important kind of means of publication is circulating work and ideas. So one thing that I guess I strongly dislike that I wanted to push against is a critical tendency to reduce the complexity of the Black arts era, to suggest that our current moment is somehow and necessarily more advanced because it comes after it, or that those people could be dismissed through some straw man version of their arguments. But I'm also really reacting against people who build a kind of way of talking to the music that allow them to say things about it without ever having to listen to a note. To say that the music is just linked to Black survival or to Black resistance or to a certain version of Black politics, you can say that and it's not untrue, but the kind of complexity, this particulars, the disagreements between people, I think, get lost. And so wanting to really reopen a possibility to think of these artists as complex, as varied, and as interested in things beyond the kind of narrow US race relations that, I mean, in the chapter on Cecil Taylor and Jean Lee, it's really about how they're rethinking subjectivity through improvisation and kind of embody subjectivity in really meaningful ways that if you only think about, say, their relationship to the European art music tradition, you would entirely not be able to hear or understand. So I know one thing that motivated the work on soul from reading it is something similar. It's the kind of way that post-soul discourse has come to predetermine soul for us. But I'd love to hear more both about that and other things that motivated you negatively, but also positively. What was the love that drove your book?
Yeah, thank you. So the love, as for you, it was the love of the music. My first book ends with a comparative analysis of Nikki Giovanni and Aretha Franklin. And that was the moment when, in writing the dissertation that would become a book, I really felt like, okay, this is where the passion lies. As much as I love the other writers and musicians in that particular interdisciplinary study, it was when I arrived at that I was both particularly galvanized by the material, but also by the surprising to me dearth of scholarship on either of those artists. That it might be surprising to people outside of the field of kind of Black musical study that Aretha Franklin is not the subject of very many scholarly analyses whatsoever. I mean, that was certainly true when I was writing the dissertation in 2008, 2009, but I think it's not that different now, So a desire to address the gap, to kind of put something there, something that was as beautiful as I could make it, into that space, motivated by such virtuosic listeners and writers as Nathaniel Mackey, who I know is an influence on you as well, and somebody who taught me anyway to not take any note, any moment, any, vocal idiosyncrasy for granted, right? That you could build a whole argument around these particular performative moments and things that might even seem kind of strange, like something that I talk about is Al Green's somewhat inchoate approach to lyrics, right? But that, you can, and this is also to say that you don't have to idealize musicians and put them up on a pedestal as if they were like, people, flawless gods and goddesses who never did anything wrong. You can, you can notice things that are almost like funny and quirky and intriguing, and you can make something of that. So that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to create a really engaging portrait of this music and the people that made it, and to show again that, it was real for people. The idea of having soul and of being bound together by this concept was very powerful for people. And to take that seriously as it worked in that moment, rather than to your other point about post-soul and what you were saying too about this kind of self-serving notion that everything that comes after that era, the Black Power, Black Arts era, is somehow more enlightened, more inclusive and more kind of I don't know, attuned to a certain kind of intersectional analysis. I just wanted to say, like, not so fast. Like, before we, congratulate ourselves on having like gotten over everything that was granted problematic, about that era in terms of the kind of heterosexism and misogyny and sometimes, a narrow view of, who and what counted as Black. Before we, assume that that's all in the past, and we're in this different moment, let's, first of all, maybe think about what's wrong with the moment we're in now, but more importantly, think about how complicated, beautiful, and complex, and what a contested site of debate the soul era and the music and the politics were in their own right.
I really appreciate that, and it leads me into just a question. Maybe you could reflect a bit more on the your approach and maybe resonances between our approaches as you see them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, one thing that I addressed a little bit in the very beginning is an interest in the actual material labor through which the music is created, which in and of itself, I think, tends to complicate these easy narratives of the music is about liberation, I don't know, John Coltrane told the truth. Like, okay, like that's true. That's and that's powerful. And those kinds of like commonplaces, they're almost like cliches of the tradition, do have their own kind of place and political import. In other words, I think that we could certainly read them as doing something strategic, but we would have to read them rather than take them at face value. Because once you take at face value, to refer back to some of the subjects in my first book, Billie Holiday sang her life. You don't have to ask any more questions. You're basically done. And you know what you think you know about the life, therefore you know what you think you know about the music. And it just sort of it puts an end to questioning as opposed to reopening a question and inviting new ways of listening. So to think about how the music actually comes together, to do what I could to at least imagine the processes through which some of these artists were training, and the labor that they put into their craft was important for me, as I think it is for you.
Yeah, I mean, along similar lines, there's a narrative of Langston Hughes that after he has to go before Joseph McCarthy's subcommittee, that he abandons his kind of Popular Front era or communist leanings, which I think that casts us a lot with the civil rights movement. And within that, we think we understand what his communism was. We think we understand what the civil rights movement is. And we read that instead of reading the poem. And the poetry just on the page is more complex. His real investment with the newly liberated governments in Africa in particular, his references to Azikiwe and Nkrumah and others, it's really much more of a line with what he had already been doing in the 30s. For example, when he visits and writes about Haiti during the occupation and then after, so that the kind of narrative, the will to just sort of superimpose these scripts, or we think that, oh, jazz lost its audience because it was elitist, and people like Archie Shepp, say, or Cecil Taylor will be pointed to as evidence of both decline and of elitism, when these are all working class people. Cecil Taylor, not so much. He's not exactly working class, but many others associated with the music were from very humble backgrounds, including John Coltrane. And so the kind of weird way that people want to assume that they understand what the audience for this music would be, rather than being curious about it, or just want to sneer at the ways that, for example, Shep or Amiri Baraka talked about making music for the people, that passes as a kind of critical and aesthetic judgment that really just walks around actually having to contend with both their work on the page and the sound of it. So there, I think we really do converge. And maybe one point of divergence is, I was really taken by the ways you are thinking about these artists working within major labels and kind of shaping their work and shaping the public for their work through those. Whereas the artists that I study, with the exception of Motown running Black Forum for a time, which Amiri Baraka released a record through, are largely using smaller independent labels and are really able to get their work out, because jazz's audience was already shrinking before free jazz started. It doesn't shrink as a consequence of free jazz.
Yeah, I mean, I know you have to go in a second, but I'll just quickly add on to that is another salient difference that we were just discussing recently, is just that the smaller labels allow for more, I don't know if you would use the term avant-garde, but certainly more kind of experimental, even cacophonous types of musical experiments, right? And whereas the artists that I'm working with are more invested in melody and in, certain conventional forms of musical beauty, which is related to, I think, the relationship that we're tracing between the music that we're looking at and the poetry in your case, and the kinds of worlds that work is imagining. My artists, I think, are a little bit more, I don't want to say accommodationist, but I think that they are a little bit more geared toward helping people survive the world as it is. Whereas yours are more invested in helping people reimagine the world as it might be.
I think that that's true. There's a real utopian strain among jazz musicians that, for whatever reason, despite their coming out of the church, in many cases, soul artists don't tend to voice in quite the same way. Yeah. So, unfortunately, I will have to leave early, and I'm sorry I won't be able to stick around for the Q&A. We've had a small issue that we have to deal with, but I want to thank the organizers and for having us, for putting this event together, and thank everybody who came to listen and to be in conversation. Bye, everybody.
I'll just, as we sort of like recalibrate, I'll just clarify what happened is literally 2 minutes before this event started, we got a notification from our children's school that there's been a COVID case. Somebody associated with the school has tested positive. So we got this sort of like, urgent message that said one of us needed to come pick up the kids. We're married, for those of you who don't know. We have the same kids. One of us needed to go pick them up from their school. So that's why he had to jet. But, under no other circumstance would he just have to leave this kind of special conversation that people have worked so hard to organize, midway through. So apologies for that. That's what's going on. And I'm happy to field questions from Valerie or from anybody else who might have them at this point.
There's definitely no apologies. I would like to remind everyone to please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen to ask any questions for Dr. Lordi. If you would, just continue to tell us more about your book, your inspirations, and we'll get questions. I think we have, well, we have one comment. Nate says, "We hope the kids are okay." Anyone else?
Nate, But I'm happy to speak a little bit about something that Anthony and I had planned to address, which is we were going to ask each other what we hoped our new books would sort of do, both in the world, for the broader, I guess, non-academic public, as well as for other scholars. And I can just quickly address that. What I'm hoping the impact will be, I guess, of the work that I do in the meaning of soul is, first of all, and most basically, I hope to reattune people to the importance of Black women in leading this particular musical tradition. People think of Aretha, but I think that they think less often of a Nina Simone or an Ann Peebles, who was, Al Green's label mate on High Records in Memphis. They think less of Minnie Riperton, maybe, who's more often thought of, if at all, as a kind of pop star than as a soul artist. And so thinking about the women and their, really not just their participation in, but their leadership of this particular musical tradition. So for example, the way that the story of soul gets told, in the kind of like PBS documentary, is to say, there's a moment in the mid to late 60s where Black men start recording more political songs, right? Sam Cooke's The Change Is Gonna Come is a good example of that. In the late 60s, we get a more militant anthem, such as James Brown's Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. But people don't talk about Nina Simone's Mississippi Goddamn, which predates Sam Cooke's anthem as being a forerunner of this sort of so-called political turn in soul music, right? And that, I think, just is because people don't still tend to think about women, and Black women particularly, as the progenitors of ideas, as people who come up with things and start doing them in the first place, and then other people kind of follow their lead. And so that was something that I wanted to highlight. And also just to say that the music of soul artists, I just would like people to listen a little bit more carefully, so that they don't reduce it to this one message. Sam Cooke's The Change Is Gonna Come is about like hoping for social change. Like, that's true, but if we think about like how he performs the song, and the way that, the longing in his voice is doing its own kind of work, perhaps alongside and maybe even in tension with the lyrics, that's the kind of listening practice that I was hoping to engender among people. And I guess that's the main thing that I was hoping the work would do for and with kind of broader readership beyond the academy.
All right, thank you, Dr. Lordi. We have 3 questions and more are coming in, so we're going to get started on those. The first one is from Jeffrey Hutchinson. He is one of our AVBA board members. I'm assuming that you dove into the music as you went through your research. Did you develop a new appreciation for particular artists?
Oh, yes. I had developed a new appreciation for all of my artists, to be honest, but I'll tell you the one that was perhaps most surprising to me was to learn about more of the social activism of Isaac Hayes. When I thought of Isaac Hayes, I think, as a lot of people, maybe especially of my generation, think about Isaac Hayes as, like the seductive, the man who was like singing these ballads, very sexual, very romantic, very alluring. And then if you look a little closer, you see he was also a musical genius, who on an album like Hot Buttered Soul from 1969 really expanded the possibilities of what soul could be with these like long tracks. Every track, there's 4 tracks on that album. People who don't know it, I highly recommend delving in. There's 4 tracks on the album, and they're all, several of them are 12 minutes long. And he was doing these covers and just, completely reimagining them with these elaborate, like classical orchestral kinds of arrangements. And they were also extremely funky, and it was just amazing. But what I didn't know was how much on the ground activism he had done, for example, to help people register to vote. He was part of a group that was almost like the Black Panthers, actually, elsewhere, sort of policing the police, and was very vigilant about, anti-Black practices within the communities and neighborhoods that he was a part of in Memphis. And so that was something that just helped me appreciate him as an icon and as an artist even more. And it helped me to hear, even in the romantic love songs, a possibility of understanding that he was singing maybe to one particular woman, but he was also singing to a people.
Thank you. Our next question is from Nate Marshall. I'm curious about how you think about the dynamic between the musical composition and the lyric in soul, or in Black music more broadly. Second part of the question, does soul have a particular relationship or is it more typical of the Black musical tradition?
The way that I think about the relationship between the lyric and the composition, I guess would sort of vary from performance to performance, honestly. But I can talk a little bit about, and this is sort of to wind the two questions together. I begin the book with a close reading of Gladys Knight and the Pips' "Gotta Use My Imagination" from 1973. And I point out that although that song, the lyrics of that song were composed by white songwriters who are, hit makers in the music industry at the time, it is a very Black song. And what I mean by that is that it's specifically rooted in the Gladys Knight and the Pips' performance of those lyrics sounds different they do something different with it than somebody who doesn't come out of the same tradition that they do, right? That song, as sung by another group of the moment, would sound very different. And again, it's not because Gladys Knight and the Pips sort of like just naturally inherit this essential kind of Black musical style. It's because they're rooted in the church. And that is what is most specific to soul music, is the way that it brings together certain performative practices rooted in Black churches, brings that together with kind of blues sensibility, and with kind of R&B stylistic kinds of techniques. And so, one example of that is, I've got to use my imagination, is there's this kind of like gradual but very determined build to that song, right? Where slowly but surely Gladys Knight starts doing more and more with her voice. She starts the song at one place in her voice, and then she leaps up to the octave, and she, for the second verse, and we get this more and more elaborate kind of orchestration, and the Pips come in and sort of do different things, and their high falsetto vocals themselves, I think is very much something that's coming out of the church tradition. But the build specifically is something that I think of as characteristic of, if not exclusive to, Black musical practice, right? Where people kind of take their time, right? And this isn't my idea. There's Melanie Burnham is a musicologist who has kind of theorized this performative practice within kind of Black worship traditions. But that's an example of how, whoever's writing the lyrics, the artists who are there to perform them are really making something that is entirely, I won't say entirely their own, but that is an extraordinary work of creation that is, again, kind of rooted in Black musical practice, and therefore has particular meanings, I think, with regard to the moment, within Black culture at that time.
Thank you. Our next question is from Sherry Malman. Have you considered the contemporary carrying on of this tradition? Who do you see carrying this resilience torch into the new messy generation and beyond?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I do a little bit of that work in the final chapter of the book, and thinking about actually in each chapter I kind of bounce forward to think about somebody who is inheriting this particular soul legacy. So every chapter, I guess I should have said, is about like a particular performative practice, whether that's the use of an artist's kind of high falsetto range, or this idea of the false ending, which is where performer seems like they're ending the song, but then all of a sudden they strike it back up and keep going. And the latter is probably the best example of how the music can embody these ideas of Black resilience, right? This idea that like you might think it's over, but it's not. Like there's some kind of spirit and energy that is very much a collective energy that's going to make sure this thing keeps going, right? And so I talk about how contemporary artists can be seen to use those similar practices in their work. And there's a lot of examples that people could think of. I mean, we have D'Angelo would be somebody, who uses the falsetto to extraordinary effect in the contemporary moment. And like his soul predecessors, who I think he would very much want to line himself up with, uses that sound to explore the possibilities of kind of the expression of Black masculinity and the expression of desire, as well as just to kind of sonically expand one's sense of the possible. So then, not unlike what Professor Reed was talking about before, my artists do that too. They might like sound conventionally better than some of the jazz artists that he is thinking about. But there's definitely a strain within soul music too that is pushing, right? That is reaching, that is aspirational. And so I see that in, a number of artists who are kind of using the falsetto, who are using the false ending. Finally, I'll just give one example of the idea of the false ending as it plays out in contemporary music and artistry. I do a close reading of this music video by the electronic artist and DJ Flying Lotus. It's called Never Catch Me. And it's a song that Kendrick Lamar features on. And in the video for it, it begins, for those of you who haven't seen it, I highly, again, recommend it. But it begins in a funeral parlor with, two Black children who have died, and they rise up, and start dancing through the aisles, and nobody can see them. There's several mourners in the church, but people can't see them, but they rise up, they dance, and they run out of the church, and they actually jump into a car and drive away. And Kendrick Lamar's verse, not unlike the musical poetry collaborations that Anthony's looking at, complicates what might look like this very kind of like celebratory, triumphal narrative of like, you thought I was gone, but I'm still here, because the children do still seem to be, nobody else can see them again, except for these other kids. So that is an example of the way that contemporary African-American artists, I think, are both using the false ending that we can associate with soul in order to suggest a kind of resilient bounce back, but they're also, I think, kind of questioning it. And so in the hands of contemporary artists, I think that what the false ending often signifies is actually kind of exhaustion with the very concept of resilience, right? The idea that one continues to have to need to be so resilient, right? And so that's just another example of how these soul legacies both carry over into the present, but also kind of change meanings and change forms.
Yeah, we have about 8 questions still in queue, so I want to let you know, so we're going to go through them. How do you see the performativity of gender as presented in soul music, and specifically for Aretha and Women in Soul?
Okay, so I'm going to keep my answers a little briefer now that I know that there's several more questions and not that much time. Performativity, the performance of gender. One thing that somebody like Aretha is doing is she is using worship practices, again, drawn from the Black church, which was her training ground as an artist. She grew up in the church. Her father's a very famous Reverend C.L., right? Reverend C.L. Franklin, sorry. And he, kind of ushers her into this space. But then she takes everything that she's learned in the church and she brings it into this more kind of secular pop soul realm, right? And so in that very transfer, where she's continuing, I should say, to do the work of a preacher, and the healing ministry, right? Whether that's in a song like Dr. Feelgood, that is, an anthem about Black women, or women, but we could mark it more specifically as Black women's sexual pleasure and liberation, or a song like Respect, which is an even better known anthem, that's about demanding the respect, both from your partner and also from the world at large that you deserve. So whatever she's doing, it's a kind of musical ministry, but in assuming the role of the minister, she is doing something that I think is subversive in terms of gender politics, right? That's usually the role of the Black male patriarch, right? But she's sort of inhabiting it, and in that way is giving us a kind of proto-Black feminist vision.
Thank you. I know that historically there has been a debate about the classification of Black music, with some arguing that this label is limiting of the art and some saying that it helps celebrate the culture. In what ways is this problematic, and in what ways can this bring context to Black music? From my son, Akil, who's a freshman at Vanderbilt.
Oh, no kidding. Hey, that's funny. I was going to say that's an excellent question. All of these questions have been so rich and so on point. So thank you, all the people who've asked. That's something that we think a lot about. So when I think Black music, I actually think about, speaking of the writers who help us to develop ways of listening to this music, Amiri Baraka's classic work. It's literally it's called Black music. It's from the late 1960s. And he's developing it in order to talk about some of the more radical artists that Anthony is dealing with in his study. Baraka is developing the term in part as a counterpoint to the concept of Negro music, right? Because we need to understand this is a moment where the very term Black as a kind of identificatory term for Black people is being devised, is being developed. And some people are like, oh, it seems a little too risque, it seems a little too transgressive, But so for Baraka to say Black music is not just to say this is, created by people of African descent. It's for him to make a particular kind of radical claim to the work that the music is doing, which is about revolutionary imagining, revolutionary reaching. And so that's what I think of when I think of Black music. But it is true that that has also been a container historically within the industry for artists who may want to, kind of break out of the confines that Black music as a term seems to signal. And so what I would say to that is I understand that 100%. It's the same way some people don't want to be called soul artists, or don't want to be called R&B, didn't want to be called neo soul, right? This is a perennial issue for African-American Black artists in the industry. But what I would say to that is simply that both the work that I am doing and the work I think that Anthony is doing as well are trying to create a more expansive understanding of what can belong within the rubric of Black music, so that people don't necessarily have to see it as a limiting category, but can see it as a home, as a space in which to grow and experiment and develop new ideas.
Thank you. What role does Black music play in Black Lives Matter, and how might that create a new legacy for race, music, and politics?
Well, I think that music is central to Black Lives Matter, as it has been central to, every kind of political movement in this country and around the world. As to the impact that role might have on understandings of race more broadly, it's really hard to say. I think, part of what the music does, honestly, is kind of get people ready for whatever is coming next. That slow build, up to the climax it's telling its own kind of story. In other words, about how you deal in those moments when you really don't know what the future holds. And that's what it is to be. I mean, that's what it is to be alive in general, but it's also more specifically what it is to be in the midst of a radical movement, in a revolutionary moment. Like, nobody knows what's on the other side. And that's what's so daunting about it. That's why you don't necessarily want to do it, right? So I would just say that I think that the role of music is, it's hard to say what it's going to mean for, racial formation or racial justice in the future. But I do think that it helps people get ready or equate themselves precisely with that condition of not knowing.
Thank you. Considering how much technology has changed the ways in which music can be recorded, has your research shown any interesting themes in how soul music was and is recorded versus other types of music?
Gosh, that's a great question. How soul music was recorded. I don't know that I discovered that much about what was unique to the recording of soul music. And I honestly wish that I had. This is a question that Anthony would have been much more well suited to answer, because he is more attuned than I am to like what's actually happening in the studio. But I think that, for me, I guess one thing that I can say is I was interested to discover how, like oftentimes it wasn't a live studio situation. Like, people were recording different tracks, at different times. And, there would be like the backing instrumental track that would happen in one place, or the strings would be recorded somewhere. And then the vocalist would kind of go in, and that it was like a kind of patchwork and piecemeal process, which perhaps shouldn't have been surprising to me. But I think that because the live performance of soul was such an intense, often communal event, right, with the singer and the band and everybody, in the audience kind of feeling, ideally, right, like feeling the funk together. It was surprising to learn that, in the recording of some of these songs was about stitching together, these different pieces from various moments and places. So I guess that would be the thing that I found most sort of surprising about the enterprise of capturing some of this stuff on disc.
Thank you. Before, you alluded to the particular problems or issues we see in the music now, as opposed to what problems were happening during the CRM or BAM.
Mm-hmm. Oh, sorry. Before you alluded to the particular problems or issues we see in the
now as opposed to what problems were happening during the CRM or BAM?
Yeah, I mean that's sort of a broader kind of cultural thing, that there's class division just as there was then. There's, lines that are drawn on the basis of gender and sexuality, and the very fact that people had to raise a call, Black trans lives matter, shows, right, that there's still some blind spots even within people who imagine themselves to be within community with each other. And so that was all that I really wanted to suggest, is that it's not as if, I think it's sometimes easy. Honestly, it's not unlike the way that the South is sometimes demonized, right? In terms of like national, regional terms, right? That everything kind of bad and backwards happens in the South. And then people in the North can imagine themselves to be, kind of like way more racially enlightened and, is this kind of like special bastion of, post-slavery righteousness. A similar thing happens when people break down the history of the soul moment versus the post-soul moment. Oftentimes is that there's this idea that everything that was sort of like bad gets lumped into this pre-1960, pre-1970, say, era. And the suggestion is that, everything that happens afterwards is like that much better, but that's actually not how history works, right? And we need to understand that if we're going to invest in making change in the present, right? That things don't just go away and get better because time moves on.
Who is your favorite Black feminist performer, and what is your favorite song that you have studied?
Gosh, my favorite Black feminist performer. That's such a hard question. I mean, I don't know. I guess the person that I've spent the most time with is Aretha Franklin. And in terms of Black women, Black people who could be considered Black feminists. My favorite song, I mean, the song that I have studied most closely perhaps of hers is her performance of Amazing Grace, a live performance that she does on the album of that name, Amazing Grace. And what I love about it, there are many things that I love about it, but one is that she has this very dramatic slow build, that she does with her performance of the song that makes everybody, it seems, come together in anticipation of these climactic notes that she's going to hit, and you can see this in the film of that performance. So people are just like so moved and so thrilled that she kind of brings people there together. And the lyrics themselves do that kind of communal work, because she sings at the end, not, grace has brought me safe thus far and grace will lead me home, but it's grace has brought me safe thus far and grace will lead me and my people home. Grace will lead us home. And so just that like really beautiful call to community, and that idea that, the community is not going to get there as a series of atomized individuals, which is more how I think we're trained to think about it today, right? A series of individuals who are kind of on their own hustle, right? Making their own way. Aretha in that moment in the church is saying the way that people get over is by banding together, and there's really no other way to do it. And that for me is just a beautiful affirmation of the kind of collectivity that soul was about fostering and sustaining.
We have two more questions. What are your thoughts on a group like the Floaters, a minor act who might be considered a bit less serious than other artists, but seem to have a fun and joyful role to play in the history of Black music? Is that sort of novel artist important in its own right, or is it frivolous? It's certainly fun to listen to.
These questions are so good. Yeah, I love that. I mean, I wish I had made a little more space, I guess, in my study for the so-called frivolous, for the fun, for the song that doesn't really have to be that heavy in order to be valuable, in order to be worthwhile. But I do think that, again, the point of the book is really not to say, here are soul artists and here are the people who are not soul artists. It's rather to encourage a certain kind of listening that helps us hear in, whatever kind of music we want to gather under the very wide rubric of soul, helps us hear how that music encourages a certain notion of resilience. And so we can actually apply that. It's a very portable concept, or hermeneutic, as the scholars would say, a way of a reading practice right? Is where you read for a certain thing. So you can find it where you look for it, in other words. And if you want to see in a group like the Floaters, or a group like the Supremes for that matter, who also kind of fall out of my study, but who could nonetheless be gathered within its arms. If you want to see a kind of, resilience that happens precisely through that kind of just like good times, that insistence on having fun in the midst of it, right? Or not even in the midst of it, just having fun because like you want to have fun. That's its own kind of overcoming, that's its own kind of refusal of the status quo that says, no, your life like needs to be hard all the time. You need to be like thinking about racism all the time. You need to be, I don't know, just struggling and suffering. And I think that some of these groups were saying like, there's a time and place for that. That is not going to define Black people as a group, and so in that way, they were really offering different kinds of musical possibilities that we can take seriously, even if the music and the musicians didn't take themselves that seriously. Like that was sort of, that not taking yourself that seriously was kind of the point.
Thank you. And this is our last question. How do you feel about, well, we have one more come up, but how do you feel about white musicians singing or performing this music, especially if these individuals didn't grow up in the church?
Yeah. I mean, how do I feel about it? I mean, I guess what I tend to feel like is, I mean, and partly as a white scholar of this music, like I understand the draw and the love that leads one to want to give oneself over to the study or the performance or the practice, the training, that this tradition demands. But I also do think that it means something different. So again, that mode of reading that I was describing just now, suggests that you can play the music, whoever you are, but it's going to mean something different. That the discourse around soul that was precisely about Black survival means that a Black performer's performance will mean something different in and of itself and to Black audiences and others than the performance of a white artist. So again, I don't think that, I think questions of appropriation are so kind of slippery when it comes to American music. And this is something that Ralph Ellison taught us long ago. It's so fundamentally intermixed. But there are questions of who profits on the music, that need to be taken very seriously. And so that would be one way to look at it, who's getting paid from the innovations of Black musical artists. But in terms of participating in the music, that doesn't bother me. It's just that I don't think that it has the same sociocultural valence, as it does when it is a Black artist performing the music. Because again, soul was a Black concept, so it just sort of by definition, it's not going to mean the same thing when somebody else is doing it.
Thank you. We have two more questions, and I think these will probably be our last two. Are there any particular lessons or themes from your study of soul that academic music departments can adopt as they engage in reckoning with their white past and decolonizing their curriculum? Obviously, the acknowledgement and study of the music as legitimate is very important, but are there lessons from the history of this music that can guide us in an authentic way? I am a DMA student at another institution, but a family member of a Vanderbilt alum. Thank you for your presentation and scholarship. Look forward to reading your book.
Thank you. So themes from the book that can influence this field of musicology more broadly as a historically very white field, so a racist field. Was that the? Is that?
The question says, how can your study of soul music help academic music departments adopt, how can they adopt and engage in reckoning with their white past and decolonizing their curriculum?
I mean, I don't.
And I guess the second part was, are there lessons from the history of this music that can guide us in an authentic way?
I guess, kind of relates back to, honestly, like the answer with regard to the Floaters question. It's perhaps understanding that there, as one sort of integrates the study of Black music into one's curriculum, that even if one is doing so, as a kind of compensatory gesture, in other words, to try to remedy or repair, a sort of historical exclusion of these artists and people who care about them and survive by them. That we can't do it we can't bring the music in and then read it through these very set ideas about what Black music is and what Black music does. In other words, for example, we can't read it just as a response to racism, right? So developing different ideas, and this is partly by listening to what the musicians themselves say about the music, that is always instructive. But just developing new ways of hearing it, that again, aren't always agonistically defined in relation to a white power structure. That's the best advice I could give.
And this is our last question. Thank you for your extraordinary research. Thanks for adding depth to my understanding of this music. Do you have a recommendation for research in this area that tilts toward the earlier blues artists?
Is that a reading recommendation or a recommendation for scholarship that the questioner might do?
Recommendation for research in this area.
Oh my gosh, there's so much research that needs to be done. I mean, I'm particularly on blues women. A great starting point is Angela Davis's Blues Legacies in Black Feminism, which looks at a series of artists such as Bessie Smith, Billie Holiday, as kind of what she would call proto-Black feminist actors. People who didn't necessarily have an organized cultural concept of Black feminism that their work could resonate into and speak to, but who were laying the groundwork for later Black feminist thought. So, you can look to a book like that to see how one of our most extraordinary thinkers took these musicians' work, lyrics, as well as performance very seriously and thought about it carefully and with nuance and complexity. That's but one example. But you could also look to her to see, who the canonized figures are and who might be sort of left out of that tradition. But there's a lot of work still to be done on blues women, as well as somebody like Ethel Waters, and other people who don't neatly fit, into the categories that we have of the blues singer versus the person kind of in the musical theater world versus the person, doing this kind of thing, doing jazz, right? That there are all kinds of people who kind of move between these realms, and to study them, I think would be an invaluable contribution to the scholarship. Thank you for asking about that.
I would like to thank you, Dr. Lordi, for that absolutely wonderful presentation and fielding these absolutely fabulous questions. I want to thank you and your husband again for being with us today. Before we end today's event, I would like everyone to notice that there is a survey posted in the Q&A. If you would please take that survey for the alumni office, that would be great. Also, before we end today's event, I want to highlight vuconnect.com as a way for alumni, parents, and students to stay connected on current Vanderbilt and AVBA programming, including an event that AVBA is having on December the 2nd. It's our Doors and Dialogue event. We're exploring all the virtual Vanderbilt's offerings. We're going to have a dialogue regarding campus safety and social justice issues on the campus. We hope you will join us for our next event. Thank you for attending and have a wonderful afternoon.